I'm Callie Crossley, host of Under the Radar 89.7. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube with our post show, continuing our discussion on critical race theory. So to all of you, U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland has issued an order that his folks talk with local law enforcement about how to stop the kind of violent harassment of school officials and other people who may be involved in schools, K through 12 school systems, who inadvertently have gotten caught up in this critical race violent debate. I mean, and it is really violent in the level of its debate. Is that a way to put the brakes on some of this? Because as we've discussed in the show, there's already some laws on the book blocking words, blocking efforts by school systems, even defunding, if we can use that word, some of the school systems if the teachers dare to use certain or teach about certain policies or use certain words. So, Michael, can this put some serious brakes on this in a way?
I think that folks who want to put an end to this have to use all tools at their disposal. That means community organizing, showing up to the meetings, supporting teachers, doing the scholarship itself, and yes, supporting legal efforts if these cases about appropriate instruction do go to court. Because one of the things that our legal system can do is hold people accountable, right? If the laws are discriminatory or if the narrative and stories they're telling are unjust, right? Conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, for example, was just held accountable for some of the lies that he told about the shooting in Connecticut through a legal decision, right? So I think that that's the role of the courts, is it can enforce some accountability when folks are overstepping, and it can also challenge some of the discriminatory laws when it comes to the employment status of teachers and things along those lines when it comes to this issue.
Who else would like to add to that?
I would say this, that it's not just, of course, about critical race studies. The Garland has stepped in because you have real violence that's taking place, threatening, attacking teachers, telling them we know where you live. Part of this is about masks, it's about vaccinations, it's about any number of things. And I would also add that what we also see in this effort by Garland to protect teachers, he's expanded that also to protect election officials. It's not just teachers who are being attacked, it's anyone who's being attacked, and the threat of physical violence is real. We saw from January 6th that this is not, this is almost like a dress rehearsal. And then you have the excuses coming in from largely Republican politicians who have basically given a shelter to those ideas and given comfort to those individuals who take part in these efforts to overturn school boards, and who threaten school officials and who threaten election officials. So this is part of a wider problem of violence in American society that's being perpetuated by the far right and being protected, if you will, by mainstream conservative politicians, largely within the Republican Party.
Deborah?
I would just like to say that we need to bring the same energy to protecting educators that we bring to protecting the kind of public servants that we beloved, like police and firefighters.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Renee?
I agree. I mean, the fact that you have, teachers being attacked, school officials being attacked, people on school boards, but also nurses and doctors, people who are actually trying to do things to make the society better, who are trying to protect us, they're being attacked. And again, what you end up with are people saying, I don't need the aggravation. I really don't need this. There was a story recently about a youth hockey league that is having trouble finding referees because so many referees are getting attacked by parents and coaches. It's the same thing. So who's going to end up being teachers? Who's going to end up being the school superintendents when they have idiots showing up outside their houses screaming and threatening them? So yes, I think, whatever can be done to protect them, I think has to be utilized.
Deborah, something you said I think it's interesting because I keep thinking, well, even if there is some legal action that is about to be taken, if other people are fighting back as much as they can in various local school systems to try to stop it, running against these people, speaking out, explaining once again, critical race theory was never in K through 12. You have a time lapse gap when some of this stuff will be implemented. So this Wisconsin Assembly, if they're successful, they're the teachers who can't say all of these words. And I mean, they're way more than I mentioned. The list is endless. So what do you do in the interim to make sure that the students are not missing the information that is so valuable? And Deborah, I'm reaching out to you to talk about how you said you learned history not in school anyway, for the most part. Yeah.
Exactly. I actually went to school for several years down the road from those moms in Tennessee. And, education, school is one place where children are educated. You're also educated in your home. You're educated in your faith-based spaces and community spaces. And so I grew up going across the street to the Taylor Family Library because they had several generations of people who went to Fisk University. And that's where I learned to read all of the Black authors that I reveled in, because I couldn't necessarily find those books in my school library. And it was at church where we learned how to recite poems like The Creation and, the history of the Black church, for example, the role of the AME church in the Black freedom struggle. And so I think that we need to exercise our agency as parents, and for me, an auntie, to make sure that our children get these lessons by any means necessary while we're working on what's going on inside the schoolhouse walls.
Well, I had a similar experience. And in fact, even in the high school that I attended, which 19 of us helped integrate very late in, it should have been way integrated. But anyway, I, in my American history class, had read all of these books like you had, and so I would bring in this extra information, which was not appreciated by my class, I can tell you. However, I bet you there's some white students walking around out there right now who know some stuff they did not know before relative to the rest in their cohort. So while this is a good way to do it, and I think that'll happen for so many people, we still have clear examples, Tulsa being one of them, where neither Black nor white folks and everybody else had any idea still in 2020, 2019, whenever that discussion first started about looking at the Tulsa massacre in a serious way. It was shocking to find out how many people didn't know that story, and many more basic ones. So how do we bring along all those people? Like, I think about those white young people who were standing up at the rallies all around. If some of this stuff is in place, even temporarily, they don't get to know either. Anybody? I'll take anybody who wants to respond to my little rant here.
I'll take up the the idea of Tulsa. What a lot of people didn't even know that happened until it was part of a plot line in a TV show, Watchmen. And a lot of people sort of ran to Google and went, wait a minute, that actually happened? They had no idea. This is like 2018, 2019. That's appalling. What it's also interesting in the way that if you knew about it, it was called the Tulsa Race Riot, as opposed to, which it was not a riot, it was a massacre. And even the wording of that tried to defang what actually happened in 1921 by the idea of saying, oh, well, this was something about, Blacks and whites were fighting as if this was equal. No, this was about whites going into an independent Black community and wiping it out. And nobody knew about that. And that's very intentional. There's a reason why it wasn't in the history books. But then again, look, I'm a New York public school kid, and I learned that Christopher Columbus discovered America. And I learned that the Civil War was about states' rights and not about slavery, although we actually kind of knew better. That's the way it's always been taught. Right now in Texas, what they're trying to do is they'll talk about slavery, but they want to talk about it as an aberration, as a little deviation from form, not 250 years of it. And to quote something that Ta-Nehisi Coates said, slavery wasn't a bump in the road, it was the whole damn road. And that's what they don't want to teach. They want, they either want to teach you nothing or teach you that this was just one little minor thing that happened, which is why we can forget about it. So, a lot of what I learned, I had to learn on my own. I didn't learn it in school. In some cases, I didn't learn it in college until I started taking classes specifically in African-American culture and history. That's how I got up to speed on a lot of these issues, because it wasn't being taught.
So we're talking about even the small amount that was being taught, sometimes badly, going away. And now what? So we just have people walking around with a big lie or no information at all?
Well, we have to counter it. I mean, without question, there have to, as all my colleagues have said, there have to be major efforts to counter this, and there have been. You think about, Renee mentioned Texas. I'm thinking about another example in Texas. All of us grew up with a Hollywood version of the Alamo, and we grew up with a historical version in the books about the Alamo, and we saw these heroic figures, Davy Crockett, and so on and so forth. It's only recently that Latino educators and researchers in Texas basically found that the Alamo was not the way it was portrayed. It was essentially an effort by Mexican nationalists, the area that would become Mexico, to protect basically their own integrity, their own project, their own area of sovereignty, if you will, and so the whole Alamo thing, just as one example, is also an illustration of revisionism. And now, with this attack on, again, so-called critique of critical race theory, the idea now is basically to push back any objective telling of history and to present a false portrayal that sadly has been buttressed by Hollywood, because Hollywood producers grow up with the same level of propagandistic historical revisionism. And so I think it's really up to us, certainly as individuals, as people who are forward-thinking, as people who believe in democracy, basically to try to preserve and to fight for accurate, objective frames in the telling of history. Just one last thing. In graduate school, we had to push back against this, even in the telling of international affairs. And at the Fletcher School, we formed something called the W.E.B. Du Bois Society of Law and Diplomacy to counter a framework of telling of history that basically glorized and gave excuses to colonialism and to imperialism at the time when I was in graduate school, just as one example.
Michael, you're in the classroom. Now, you're in the classroom with some really smart people, but I'm curious about how often you might find some of them unaware of what should be a part of American history that's well known. And I want to preface that with a story that Clint Smith, who's the author of the book, How the Word is Passed, a story that he told about visiting Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's place, just on a regular tour. He just wanted to see what a regular tour was like. And the people there were giving the full history. You know, here's Thomas Jefferson, here's where the enslaved people were, here's how many he owned, blah, blah, blah. And he noticed that there were a couple of women, white women on the tour who were absolutely flummoxed, shocked. First time they ever heard that Thomas Jefferson, one of the founders of the country, had enslaved people. And so he went to talk to them afterwards, and they were very frank about, this is just something we had not heard. That's where we're at. What do you see in the classroom?
I mean, my personal experience as a professor is that I haven't had many of those moments with the students in my courses where that sense of shock that you just described related from Clint Smith, I haven't had many of those moments. But I think at a college like mine, we have students from literally all over the world. So those of us who teach in these fields, we don't go into it assuming that folks have a kind of basic understanding, right? That's why we're there. We're there to provide people with evidence-based instruction, regardless of what the topic is, so that no matter where you're coming from or starting from, we can get to some common ground based on historical facts and evidence. That's what we do in my profession, whether you're a scientist, a historian, whatever it might be, that's what we do. And that's a great privilege. that we have, right? To be able to start at that place, to take it on good faith that our students are going to dive in and really digest and work through the material with us. So that experience of, wow, this is a huge wake-up call, is not that typical. Having said that, we're all learning new things all the time, honestly. Even those of us who teach these subjects for a living, we're learning details of new massacres, unfortunately, and corrections to the historical record are coming out all the time. So we can't condemn people or dismiss people for not knowing, if that's truly the case. We've got to have a growth mindset, right, for ourselves and for all those that we come into contact with about these issues. Not that we never hold folks accountable when they do wrong, but that we allow for the possibility that we can move to a better place as professors, as students, as community members, as people who are working on the product of democracy together. We've got to keep that belief alive. And I think I have the privilege of doing that in my role, but I can understand how it's deeply frustrating in other spaces where education is supposed to be happening one way, and they're really depriving students of the kind of evidence-based instruction that I described.
Well, that's a great place to end this powerful conversation, and no doubt we'll be talking about it again. I thank all of you for joining me.
Thank you.